Hi there, this is Natalie, and now that we're deeper into the second core of Mushoku Tensei, I think it's a good time to take a look at the character of Paul Greyrat. This will be a character analysis of Paul up to the events currently being shown in the anime, so it will be safe for anime-only Mushoku Tensei fans. I may mention the odd bit of information about him from the novels that hasn't been shown on screen, but there won't be any spoilers about what happens to Paul or any other characters later on in the series, or revelations about any general plot points. If you do want to see Mushoku Tensei content that does go into the light novels and web novel, then please subscribe and ring the bell, because I do both anime only and novel reader content about Mushoku Tensei, along with ReZero, plus some other general anime content. It really helps me out if you subscribe, like the videos, and leave a comment with your thoughts, so please consider doing that. And with the spoiler threat level and the YouTuber stuff out of the way, let's talk about Paul. Paul is a character who really exemplifies the way characters in Mushoku Tensei are written. Extremely flawed, not always forgivable, but never a fixed one-dimensional person. Paul can't be placed in a box and labelled as the womanizing trash, or the heroic but roguish adventurer, or the caring but inexperienced father, or the unconventional leader who gets results. He's all of those things at once. And he's also, sometimes, just an ordinary guy trying to do the right thing, but also trying to have fun. Trying to fix his mistakes, but also making more of them. He'll never be a villain, but he hurts people. He'll never be a paragon, but he helps people. You can hate him for one action and still root for him to succeed in another. And that's not just how he can make the reader feel, but how he makes the characters around him feel too. And all of this makes him one of the most interesting characters to talk about. We see him at the start of the story, when Rudeus is first born, as an experienced and accomplished adventurer who is, for the first time, trying to live as a responsible husband and father, having left his exciting life of labyrinth diving with his close-knit party behind after getting the party's healer, Zenith, pregnant. Wanting to do the right thing, Paul married Zenith and begged his estranged noble family for the job he has now, as a knight in a peaceful rural village. This is a man who has lived one way and perhaps thought that would never change, moving into a new phase in his life and basically settling down. He and Zenith made this move while she's pregnant with Rudeus, so while when we see them through Rudy's eyes, they seem pretty happy and settled as a married couple, this is all still quite new to them. And their first child turns out to be Rudeus, so a guy reincarnated from another world who has technically gotten more years of life experience than they have, even as a newborn. Even if his life was spent as a shut-in, so not much experience was actually gained. This is both a blessing and a curse in terms of being Paul's first taste of fatherhood. He doesn't know this about Rudeus, of course, and instead just sees him as an incredibly gifted, if a little bit uncanny, son. But while this means he often doesn't get to feel like the heroic father figure he might have dreamed he'd be to his first child, he does learn some lessons from the way Rudy interacts with him that he wouldn't have been able to learn from a normal kid, like his second child, Norn. A good example is when the mother of one of the kids Rudy stopped from bullying, Sylphie, tells Paul a different version of what happened, and Paul immediately tries to discipline Rudy without hearing his side of things. As an extra detail about this scene, it actually turns out that the kid's mother just wants a bit of Paul, so she comes up with any excuse to go to his house and talk to him. Still, Rudy sets Paul straight about what actually happened and lectures him on his mistake in not listening to Rudy before punishing him, which was, to be fair, a reasonably normal mistake for a father who is still just figuring things out, especially given he knows how strong Rudy is compared to other kids his age. This does teach Paul something, but it also really highlights to Paul the shortcomings his son thinks he has as a father. But the thing is, while Rudy does seem like he's talking sense here, he is in many ways viewing Paul as a father, who Rudeus, with his greater knowledge, can help to do better. not really as his father trying his best to raise him. He doesn't really get yet that while he has knowledge of a more modern and forward-thinking society, and 10 years or so more life behind him, he's never been a husband or father, never even been friends with anyone else who is, and he didn't really have a normal relationship with his own parents and siblings after he became a shut-in. And so all of his ideas about how a parent should be and how they should raise their kids are really based on fiction, or ideals he's picked up over the years, not on actual experience with real families. This means it's easy for Rudeus at this stage in the story to hold Paul up to a standard he can't reach and criticise him on his failings, something most children of that age wouldn't do. But it's also hard for Rudeus to see or accept the times when Paul actually shows himself to make some good decisions from a parental point of view, because he can't really see him as having the right to make decisions for him. He can't really see him as his dad yet, or appreciate that he does actually need someone to raise him, despite his internal age. A good example of this is when Paul decides to send Rudy away to tutor Eris, because he was concerned that Rudeus and Sylphie would become too codependent if they weren't separated. This was a good decision for Sylphie, something she recognises later, but it was also right for Rudeus. While Paul thought he was dealing with a small child who didn't want to be separated from their first friend their own age, who they clearly had dreams of one day marrying, and thought it was important for both kids to be more independent and broaden their horizons, there isn't really that much difference in the situation, even if you know Rudeus was already 34 when he was born. This is because, owing to his complete lack of a social life in his past life, having just one friend and love interest in his whole life here would still seem like enough to Rudy at this point, like a huge improvement on what he had before. Having Sylphie by his side and completely reliant on him wouldn't have seemed all that bad, just as it wouldn't to a small child with their first close friend. But to Paul, who'd experienced much more of life and of people, that would seem unhealthy, as it generally would be. And so he went as far as to beg his cousin to take Rudy in as a tutor, to force Rudy to go there without his agreement, and even to forbid him from coming home to visit, taking drastic measures that would affect their whole family, just to address the problem he was concerned was brewing with the kids becoming so close. Naturally, he couldn't have predicted what would end up happening with the teleportation incident, and thought Rudy would just grow up more over the course of the tuition work, and then decide at the end whether he still wanted to attend Ranoa Magic University with Sylphie. Eris's family had promised to pay for both of them to study there once the job was complete. This means Paul gave Rudeus a way to do what he currently wanted to do, which is to earn enough money to pay for him and Sylphie to study where his beloved teacher Roxy had. But in doing so, he also forced them both to grow as individuals, without having each other to rely on. A hard decision for a kid to understand, but definitely one he put a lot of thought and care into. And yet, despite seeing some times where Paul did well-intentioned things, or made normal mistakes that showed his lack of experience, we have to address the elephant in the room, and that is, of course, the fact that Paul cheated on his wife. I think this incident was, for most people, the point where Paul went from being a fairly likeable guy with a bit of a colourful reputation and a flawed but caring father, to being basically trash. Especially when we see that after Rudy's intervention to save Lilia and his unborn sister from a likely death if they were kicked out of the house, Paul seems to more or less face no negative consequences for doing this, taking Lilia as his second wife, and Zenith and Lilia seeming fairly happy raising their children together. And yes, Paul cheating on Zenith is really scummy. Paul is known for being a womanizer, but had promised to be faithful to Zenith. As I've said before, for some reason people in Mushoku Tensei think women can't have sex when they're pregnant, so while Zenith was pregnant with their second child, Norn, Paul was horny, and Lilia, who had a history with Paul, was also horny, after watching him and Zenith be all over each other for years without any prospects for action of her own, and she basically proved too hard for him to resist, which is very trash. To add to the trashiness, it's also worth noting that while polygamy is not unusual in the setting of Mushoku Tensei, at least not in the region where Paul lived at the time, the Church of Milis, that's the country where Rudeus and Paul were reunited, is very similar to the Catholic Church, and followers of that religion are strong advocates of monogamy. Zenith is actually the daughter of a powerful noble family from Milis, and was raised within that religion, so asking her to accept a second wife into the family is a much bigger deal than it would be with other characters who don't have a religious objection to polygamy. Paul basically really screwed up here, and those who knew him well were not that surprised, given he'd always been a renowned womanizer. It was Zenith and Rudeus's kindness towards Lilia, not forgiveness of Paul, that led to Lilia being taken on as a second wife. And while that may seem like Paul getting what he probably wanted all along, it's explained later that Zenith made him agree that he'd only sleep with Lilia if Zenith became pregnant again. So really, he's not living the harem lifestyle people, including Rudy, assumed. Instead, he has two women to support and protect, both of whom seem to get along better with each other than they do with him after this debacle. He's lost a lot of respect from his son, and there's the sense of having proved everyone who thought he couldn't be a good husband right. Paul knows he's trash. He knows people think he's trash, but since he can't turn back time, all he can do is try to take responsibility. We don't see this straight away, and neither does Rudeus. But as with most things in Mushoku Tensei, the way Paul, Zenith and Lilia found to make things work goes a lot deeper than it seemed, with everyone having to make compromises to move forward and try to do the right thing for their children. In Core 1 of Season 1, it seems like some family drama from Rudeus's childhood that is resolved without too much trouble, and in Paul's favour. But actually, the way this event affects characters and their relationships with each other continues to play a part far into the future, even affecting the lives of the daughters, Norn and Aisha, who were born in that situation. Though I won't go too into that to avoid spoilers for the rest of the season or future seasons. Still, the first we see of the way Paul's infidelity continues to affect people has already been shown in the anime at the time I'm making this video, and that is in the reunion with Paul and Rudeus in Milis. Aside from Rudeus channeling the cast of Shimonetta and fighting with pantsu on his face, to add some levity to the episode, the reunion between Paul and Rudy was an intense scene, which really shows how the characters' different experiences and perspectives work in the writing of this story to create interactions that create drama in a natural way. When you know what both characters have been through and what information they had going into this reunion, it seems like really the only way it could have gone. And yet, it wasn't what either of them could have expected with only their own knowledge. Rudeus, wanting to impress his father with how much he's grown, and how he, like Paul, has now got some exciting adventuring tales to tell, debriefs Paul about what's happened since the teleportation incident, making it sound as cool and daring as possible. He doesn't know that he and Eris weren't the only people teleported. He believed that all he needed to do was protect Eris and get her home, and that by having survived this far, even in the treacherous demon continent, and having made powerful friends like Rudeus, he'd done things his father would be proud of and love to hear about. He hasn't yet discovered why Paul was involved in what looked like a kidnapping and is hanging around with a party that includes a woman who's always wearing a bikini, or why Paul looks absolutely terrible. But it seems he's so hyped to be reunited with him and tell him all the adventures he's had that can wait. Rudeus thinks his father wants him to be like him. In short, that means he'll be happy that Rudeus can show he was brave and fought well, and that he protected the person he needed to protect. But Paul is no longer a swordsman and former adventurer who would love nothing more than to swap stories with his son. Paul knows that on the day of the teleportation incident, everybody in the entire Philua region was randomly teleported, and the cities and villages they lived in have vanished, leaving behind nothing but empty land. Paul was, of course, teleported himself, Fortunately, he was holding on to Norn at the moment it happened, so she went to the same place as him and he was able to look after her. But he had no idea where Zenith, Lilia, his other daughter Aisha, or of course Rudeus, ended up. He knows many of the people who were teleported died immediately, and the others ended up being captured by slavers. He travelled to Zenith's former hometown, and getting funding from her family, despite the fact they hate him, he formed an organisation that's working to track down survivors and free any that have been enslaved. Those were the people he was working with, and the reason they appeared to be kidnapping someone. He's spent 1.5 years trying to find his family and help other survivors, while also trying to raise his terrified daughter, and the horror and frustration of it all has taken a huge toll, with Paul having developed something of a drinking problem. But Rudy didn't know any of this, and Rudy hadn't even considered that other people might have been teleported too, except perhaps Ghislaine. After all, he, Eris and Ghislaine were at the site where something strange seemed to be happening at the time, and had just had that mysterious run-in with Aramanthi, the masked man, and so it wouldn't be that odd for him to assume the teleportation incident was far more localised than it was. But Paul and his organisation had left messages in adventurer guilds telling people to contact him in Millis and asking for people to join the search. This was actually how Roxy, Elena Lise and Talhand ended up on their own search, as we saw a couple of episodes earlier. Rudy should have passed through the adventurer guild at the port, but because he ended up involved in the whole smuggling fiasco, he never did. Because of that twist of fate, Paul and Rudy are under completely different assumptions during this reunion. The tales Rudy thinks will impress Paul instead make him think his son has been playing around for over 1 year, having adventures and flirting with Eris, when he'd been passing through places he could have been searching for information and survivors in. He's angry that Rudeus didn't write to him to let him know he was okay, and Rudeus, who was planning to write home that very day, thinking he still had a home, still doesn't know about the messages he missed at the guild when he replies that he just hadn't gotten around to it where there was a lot going on. They're both talking about different things. Not understanding why Paul is reacting like what Rudeus did wasn't good enough, and acting like it was wrong for him to worry about protecting only Eris, Rudy fires back at him with accusations around Paul's own misdemeanours with women, asking if Zenith and Lilia knew Paul was hanging around with women like the Bikini Girl. And yes, there is a thoroughly depressing and non-lewd reason why she dresses like that, but it hasn't been said yet in the anime, and so I'm going to leave it at that for now. Of course, this is when communication between them properly breaks down, and things get violent, until Norn comes in and makes Rudy feel ashamed for what she sees as bullying her dad. She doesn't remember Rudeus, who left to tutor Eris when she was still a baby, and clearly hates seeing anyone hurt the father, who's looked after her for as long as she can remember. After this, Rudeus does explain that he really didn't know, and Paul tells him more about what actually happened, Rudeus earning more of his scorn by asking about Sylphie before his mother. But even though the misunderstandings underpinning the argument have been revealed to them both, the damage to their current relationship is already done, and Rudeus can only leave, depressed. Rudeus made such accusations about Paul and other women because of Paul's reputation, because of what happened with Lilia, and also because the way he remembered Paul, he would surely have encouraged him to go after Eris. After all, Paul was always talking to him about girls, and everyone else in Eris's family seemed to be pushing them together too. Without knowing the situation, Rudy couldn't understand why Paul suddenly thought protecting a woman wasn't a good use of time. But there is a side to Paul that perhaps he never needed to show to Rudeus before, when times were more peaceful. And that side prioritises very differently when important things are at stake. Paul doesn't realise Rudy doesn't know Zenith and Lilia are missing, and so thinks his accusation that Paul has been putting sleeping with other women above dealing with the current crisis is unforgivable, when really Rudeus is just accusing Paul of a double standard. To him, Paul is a womanizer and is berating him for focusing on a girl. It is a misunderstanding, the whole conversation is, and yet it reveals to Paul what his son thought of him because of his past mistakes. And really, it is what anyone who knew Paul before would think if they didn't know what happened in between. Paul is doing his best to rescue people in this situation, but his lack of success in finding his family has already begun to make him feel like it isn't enough. And now, one of those people has returned with no help from Paul, and from his perspective is talking as though what he's done isn't enough to redeem him for his past behaviour either. Paul is angry because he expected more from his genius son, but also because his own efforts are seemingly being dismissed. He can never truly escape from the flaws in his character and the harm they did in the past, no matter how noble it seems he's being now. But Rudy isn't blameless here either, and also leaves the conversation racked with guilt. He realises he actually did have quite a lot of fun, despite the hardships of his adventures, and he feels guilty that he hadn't thought about what might have happened to other people, or tried to get a message home sooner. Even if that wasn't entirely his fault, as I said, the circumstances when he and Eris were teleported would reasonably lead them to think only people in that exact location were affected. He could have avoided the whole argument if he'd been less excited to impress his dad with his stories, and had instead first tried to figure out what the admittedly strange situation he'd found him in was about, and why Paul looked so tired, drunk, and haggard. Even if he hadn't done that, he made yet more mistakes by getting into a physical fight with his father and insensitively blurting out his question about Sylphie, which obviously wouldn't go down well after a fight about him not caring enough about his family and prioritising a different girl. He's angry with Paul for, once again, not listening to him or trying to understand his side of things, but this time he's older, and he knows he can't lay out all of his criticisms of Paul without taking a certain amount of guilt on himself. I actually don't think it could be said that the teleportation incident and the time since then completely changed Paul. I think he would always have been willing to go to great lengths for his family, and that his womanizing ways were more something that came out when he was bored or generally comfortable enough that he didn't have bigger things to think about. It is confirmed later that he hasn't slept with anyone while Zenith and Lilia are both missing. His priorities have been taking care of Norn, finding news of his family, and helping other survivors of the incident, and I don't think this was ever out of character for Paul, showing more that a crisis like this brings out the reliable, brave side of him that probably made him a successful adventurer in the first place, rather than that he needed to be put through an ordeal like this by the writer to be able to become a better person. Paul has always been a person with all of these different sides to him coexisting, which is probably why those who knew him before, like Ghislaine, have a strange love-hate type relationship with him, where they're all angry with him about something or other, but will still help him when he needs it. Rudeus, though, never truly saw the more admirable sides of him in his early years as his son, or at least never saw them in a way he truly understood. And so this is very much a turning point in how Rudeus thinks of Paul, rather than in Paul's entire personality. But what do you guys think? Let me know what you think about Paul and the reunion scene in the comments. Though since this is an anime-only video, if you want to talk about anything that happens after the latest episode, please put a spoiler warning and some blank space, so people have to expand the comment to see the spoiler. Thank you as always to my supporters on Patreon, and to all of you who support me by subscribing to my channel and watching my videos. I'm going to have plenty more Mushoku Tensei content coming soon, so if you enjoyed this video, please look out for that. Or check out some of my existing Mushoku Tensei content, some of which you'll see recommended on the end card. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again very soon.